www.aphis.usda.gov. But Googling African Swine Fever Action Week also works just as well. We will do a Q&A session at the conclusion of our presentations. And at that time, we will take questions through the Q&A. At the bottom of your screen, there is a tab for Q&A. If you click on that tab, you can enter your question, and you can enter it as you're thinking of it as people present. That is the easiest place for us to see and follow questions. If you've got an IT or a technical question, you can leave that in the chat, but it's harder to track the questions in the chat. So please direct your questions to the Q&A box, and we will capture them there, and we will go through as many as we can once our presenters have concluded. With that, I would like to turn things over to Dr. Shear, our Associate Administrator. Thanks, Dr. Shear.
Thank you, Hallie. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us, as Hallie said, on our 5th and final day of African Swine Fever Action Week. We've shared some great information over the course of the week about things like signs of African swine fever and what to look for in your pigs, steps the United States is taking to prevent and prepare for ASF, critical biosecurity information, including available resources to help producers create their own plans, and finally, what producers can expect in the event of an outbreak. I hope you've been able to join us for one or more of these webinars. But there's still some topics that we haven't really covered, and that's feral swine. We're calling today Feral Swine Friday because we want you to delve with us into the feral swine factor and the challenges that they would pose in the event of an outbreak. Next slide, please. Thank you. I want to share a few quick facts about feral swine to help set the stage for our discussion this afternoon. Feral swine are comprised of escaped or released domestic swine, Eurasian wild boar, and their hybrids. We estimate that there are at least 6 million feral swine roaming within the United States, with the most dense populations primarily being in the south and southeast. These highly invasive species cause ample damage to agriculture, natural resources, and private property. Additionally, feral swine are capable of becoming infected with and transmitting a number of pathogens that are, of course, of concern for humans, domestic livestock, companion animals, and wildlife. Most significantly, feral swine are also susceptible to ASF, which is one of the most devastating diseases of domestic swine. An ASF virus incursion will likely result in an immediate movement standstill and bring international trade to a halt, irrespective of feral or domestic swine in the outbreak. I should note here that we did recently finalize a protocol with Canada to help ensure bilateral trade would continue if ASF is detected in feral swine in either country, while still absent from domestic swine. But initially, all swine trade with Canada would stop and then resume in progressive phases. Detecting and managing a disease outbreak in feral swine and wild species is incredibly complicated. APHIS has been working diligently to prevent and to prepare to respond to an ASF outbreak in feral swine. We look forward to sharing more details with you over the course of this webinar. Before we get started, I wanted to briefly introduce our speakers. First, I'm very pleased to have with us Janet Bucknell, the Deputy Administrator for our Wildlife Services Program. Wildlife Services leads our National Wildlife Disease Program and our National Feral Swine Program, both of which are doing tremendous work. We want to talk about both programs today. So you'll hear from Dr. Juliana Linnick, our Wildlife Diseases Program Coordinator, as well as Dr. Vienna Brown, a biologist with the National Feral Swine Program. We're also going to be joined by Dr. Sarah Bevins, a research biologist with our National Wildlife Research Center, who's going to provide more detail about our ASF planning and preparedness activities in feral swine. By the end of the webinar, we hope that you will have a much more complete picture of all that we're doing to address the disease risk that's posed by feral swine. With that, I'd like to I'd like to take the opportunity to have Dr. Janet Bucknell say a few words. Janet, sorry.
Thanks, Jack.
Hey,
good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for coming together for African Swine Fever Action Week, especially for Feral Swine Friday. My colleagues and I in APHIS and within Wildlife Services are really honored to be participating in this series of events, and we're looking forward to sharing that information, some of our perspectives with you today, this afternoon, specifically about feral swine. So since 2014, as Jack had mentioned, Wildlife Services and APHIS have been conducting a national feral swine control program in the United States. And we've done active operational work in more than 30 states, maybe 36, 37 states, as well as in 3 territories. We've been working side by side with our colleagues in APHIS across the department and federal and state government, and also with our industry partners, many of whom are on this call this afternoon. So I want to thank you for all that partnership. It's really a foundational value for APHIS's work and for Wildlife Services work, so thank you. In 2019, we did initiate within APHIS a morbidity mortality surveillance for ASF as part of our feral swine work, and that's been going along these last couple years. And then in 2021, we decided to align our feral swine disease surveillance program really more closely with foreign animal diseases, particularly African swine fever, classical swine fever, and foot and mouth disease. And we have continued to monitor the production diseases, including swine brucellosis and pseudorabies, and also in addition to our foreign animal disease surveillance effort. So we did those 2 things, 2019, 2021. And then also in 21, this summer, we started to do some enhanced work in Puerto Rico after the detection of feral African swine fever in the Dominican Republic. And I think we'll hear a little bit about that today. So I do just want to thank you all for participating this afternoon and for all the work that we do together. So I'm going to wrap up my remarks here. I won't take much more of your time, but I'll turn things over to our 3 presenters this afternoon, Dr. Vienna Brown, Dr. Sarah Bevins, and Dr. Julie Lennox. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much. We're going to give them the opportunity to share their presentation, and we'll jump right in.
Can you see the slide? I can see it, but we need to go to presenter mode, please.
Yes.
Very good. Thanks so much, Hallie, Dr. Scheer, and Deputy Administrator Bucknell. I'm Juliana Lennox. I'm the coordinator for the National Wildlife Disease Program within Wildlife Services. Very honored to be here and be part of the final day, the wrap-up day of African Swine Fever Action Week. I'll be presenting with 2 of my colleagues, Vienna Brown and Sarah Bevins. And we're really just excited. I see over 1,000 people online and all the chat going on from our global partners as well as our North American. So we're very, very happy to have such a high interest in this and hope this is informative for you. Go ahead, Vienna. Can you go to next? Oh, there we go. I know many of you have been attending all week. Just wanted to reiterate kind of what a combined and high level response and coordinated effort this is. Today we're speaking to you from APHIS Wildlife Services, but as Dr. Scheer mentioned, because of the significant impact, concern, and the combined susceptibility of both feral swine and domestic swine, we really work on this step in step with our partners in veterinary services. So again, the efforts today are coming to you from Wildlife Services, but rest assured that this is an APHIS level priority and that we work on this in a very combined fashion. Next slide, please. Look, just a high level overview of where we're going. So again, coming from Wildlife Services, we really try to think of this in a comprehensive, very high level, understanding the component of animal disease, the susceptibility, again, at both the feral swine level and domestic swine level. This particular agent does not cause human disease, but we do recognize it causes human impact. whether that is food scarcity, food supply issues as far as losses to farmers or ranchers, and of course the economic impact that has the potential there. And then working with our environmental partners to make sure that we're doing everything possible to keep the virus out of the environment, decrease any susceptibility or any movement of the virus. So looking at this from a very high level, very comprehensive One Health aspect. Today's efforts, just on a breakdown, Dr. Vienna Brown will be going over our surveillance efforts. Dr. Sarah Bevins will be going into more depth on our planning and preparedness, and then I will be back to talk about a summary of our response capabilities. And we are allowing some time for question and answer, as Hallie said, so please keep those questions coming in the Q&A, and we will get back to them at the end of the presentation. Dr. Brown, over to you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Linick. Can you hear me all right, Hallie?
Yes, you're a little faint, so maybe speak louder, but you are clear.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. I'm Dr. Vienna Brown. I'm a biologist with the National Feral Swine Damage Management Program. And I'm going to take a little bit of time today to talk about the National Feral Swine Damage Management Program, some of the work that we already have ongoing related to operational efforts in terms of removing feral swine, and then a lot of the surveillance work that we have ongoing during peace times and how we're utilizing that framework to prepare for African swine fever virus. Okay. So just to kind of start with a really high level overview of feral swine in the United States, I think Dr. Scheer provided just a really brief background, and I'll go into a little more depth on that. Swine were first brought to the US in the 1500s by explorers, and there have been repeated introductions since that time. In the past 20 to 30 years, now almost 40 years, feral swine populations and distribution have greatly expanded. A huge driver of that is anthropogenic movement, or human-mediated movement. There also are escapees from fenced farming and hunting operations. And then once in the landscape, the feral swine and domestic swine and Eurasian wild boar are all able to breed and hybridize. And so they can readily become self-sustaining populations. There are believed to be well over 6 million feral swine in more than 35 states and 3 territories. Why are feral swine problematic? They are extremely destructive. In terms of damage to agriculture, there is almost not a crop they will not damage, whether that be from direct predation or consuming the crop, or from trampling, wallowing, just kind of damaging that crop to a point beyond repair. They cause incredible damages to agricultural products. They also do a ton of damage to private property and public property, golf courses, cemeteries, and some older archaeological sites. That they tend to do a lot of rooting and wallowing and can be very destructive to property. They also cause tremendous damage to natural resources. They often root and wallow in riparian areas, which are often really important for biodiversity on the landscape. They predate on eggs of ground nesting birds. They will often eat fawns or calves or lambs out on the landscape, sea turtles, and threaten and endangered salamanders, lizards, and other species. So that they often also outcompete some of our native fauna. So they can be incredibly destructive to our natural resources. And then, of course, the risks that they pose to both humans and other animals. Some of that is actual physical risk, but a lot of that is disease transmission related. So whether that be public health pathogens or the risk of foreign animal disease introduction, feral swine are a hugely problematic and risky species. In 2014, APHIS received $20 million to implement a collaborative national feral swine damage management program in states where there was a recognized feral swine population. And so we're now in almost year 7 of this APHIS level program, which is managed by Wildlife Services, with the primary goal being that we're interested in minimizing damage caused by feral swine to protect agriculture and livestock, natural resources, property, and human health and safety. And so the idea is that in states where feral swine populations are large and widely distributed, APHIS is working to suppress populations and manage damage caused by feral swine in those states. And in states where feral swine populations are low or newly emerging, we are working to eliminate feral swine in those states. And so I don't know if you guys can see this. There we go. And so we have levels 1 through 5, which are correspondent to the number of the approximate number of feral swine in each state. Level 5 is the highest. Level 1 is the lowest. And so baseline funding is proportional to the operational activities that are ongoing in each of the states. So we have California, Texas, Oklahoma, and Florida are the 4 level 5 states. Those have the highest densities of feral swine in the United States. And the largest population of feral swine, California, and then kind of Texas and Oklahoma, all the way up to that southeastern seaboard. That's really the feral swine dense states in those areas. And then we are also doing work in Guam, Puerto Rico, and the US Virgin Islands. So I wanted to kind of frame that out for how the National Feral Swine Damage Management Program is set up operationally. And as a subset of that, in addition to the work that we're doing in terms of removing feral swine to manage damage, we also have a feral swine national surveillance scheme. And so from 2017 through fiscal year 2020, we were operating kind of under what I'm calling version 1.0 of our national surveillance efforts. We had worked in partnership with VSCIA and via swine health staff to come up with 3 diseases of national concern, which included classical swine fever, swine brucellosis, and pseudorabies. We have a congressional mandate to capture or to collect a minimum of 2,800 samples annually from feral swine across the US. The program was targeted with samples distributed across both space and time, with counties being prioritized as high, medium, and low, based on existing feral swine populations, the presence of domestic hog production, and landfill presence. It is important to note that while it's a targeted surveillance approach, it is still within the framework of opportunistic sampling. So Wildlife Services does work in areas where we have cooperative service agreements, and we're being asked by landowners, public and private, to do operational work on feral swine. And so our samples are coming from these animals that are dispatched associated with those working agreements. This is all antibody-based surveillance, and so we have our apparent seroprevalence, so we're capturing the number of animals that tested positive over the total number of animals that were sampled. If we look across 2017 to 2020, we see a fair amount of continuity in terms of our national aggregated data. So if we look at classical swine fever, which of course is a foreign animal disease, we do not have it in the United States. Predictably, we have not found any feral swine with antibodies to classical swine fever over the years. For pseudorabies virus, we see antibody prevalence bouncing between about 17.5% and 24.5%. And for swine brucellosis, we see antibody prevalence jumping between about 5.5% and 10%. Again, this is data aggregated at the national level, and I'm going to go through a series of slides that demonstrate as we increase the granularity of the data, we tend to see hot pockets on the landscape. So here, if we're looking at nationwide seroprevalence of pseudorabies virus, the darker the shading, the higher the apparent seroprevalence. And as it gets lighter, we see lower and lower seroprevalence in those states. States with hash marks demonstrate that we've collected less than 10 samples for the aggregate of fiscal year 2020. And so whatever percent we get out for apparent seroprevalence is based on a really low sample size, just as a point of note. So again, if we think about this from the national level, for pseudorabies, we saw about 24.5% seropositivity for the aggregate of fiscal year 2020. If we look at that on the landscape, we do not see that on the whole. We see states like Texas and Florida and Georgia with greater than 25% seropositivity, and then a number of other states with between 1 to 5 and 6 to 10% positive. So again, just a demonstration that it is not homogeneous distribution across the landscape. And as we continue to break that down at a more granular level, we see more of that. And so if we look at the state of Texas, of course, all 3 of these, the 2 maps and all the tables are demonstrated on the aggregate of fiscal year 2020. Texas at a statewide national seroprevalence, we saw greater than 25% seropositivity. But when we look at a county level, we see a number of counties that have that greater than 25% seropositivity, but we also see a number of counties that have far lower seropositivity as that. And so, of course, feral swine do not recognize or adhere to county boundaries, but it is important to note that these diseases are not spread homogeneously across the landscape. Part of this, the difference that we see could be driven based on our opportunistic framework, but a lot of it is just that these diseases are cyclical in these populations, and so it is not spread homogeneously throughout the populations. And so these last three slides were related to pseudorabies seroprevalence, but we see the same sort of data related to swine brucellosis. So again, at the national level, aggregated data for fiscal year 2020, we saw about 10.5% seropositivity for swine brucellosis at the national level. If we look at the states broken down at the state level, we see many states that fall at about that 10%, but we also see states that fall on both sides of that 10%. And again, if we look at Texas in specific, so Texas at the state level has between 6 and 10% seropositivity. If we look at Texas at the county level, we again see a number of counties that do not have any positive samples that have been collected for fiscal year 2020. We see some that fall within that 6 to 10% seropositivity bracket that represents the statewide aggregate. But then we also see a number of counties that fall well above that. So again, this is just a depiction using there are two diseases, production diseases that are endemic in feral swine that while from a producer or from a biosecurity standpoint, it is important to think of feral swine as just generally contaminated or infected. When we actually look at the data on the landscape, we do see a little bit different of a picture in terms of there being hot pockets on the landscape, and then some pockets do not have disease prevalence. As Deputy Administrator Bucknall discussed, we did roll out morbidity mortality surveillance for African swine fever for feral swine in fiscal year 2019. And so this was based on in the fall of 2018. I'm sure many of you are intimately familiar that the African swine fever virus started making some pretty drastic global movements, kind of marching into Western Europe, jumped into China, and spread throughout Southeast Asia. And so as part of our continued effort in APHIS to be responsive and prophylactic in our thinking, Wildlife Services rolled out morbidity mortality surveillance in partnership with our state and federal partners. We have asked our field biologists, Wildlife Services field biologists, to be on the lookout for feral swine that are sick or inexplicably dead on the landscape. If they do see something that falls out of kind of the realm of normal, our folks are intimately familiar with feral swine and what to look for in normal behavior. So if they see anything that falls out of the normal, they are to reach out to their Wildlife Services state director, their state animal health official, and their area veterinarian in charge. Ultimately, the Veterinary Services area veterinarian in charge has authority on whether that animal is worked up as a part of a foreign animal disease investigation. And if so, it works through the same Veterinary Services framework as it would for a domestic animal, with samples being sent to FADL. Over the past 2.5 years now, we've had 23 animals that have been that kind of have tripped the trigger, if you will, for a morbidity mortality event. This has occurred in 8 different states, and 19 of those 23 animals were worked up as full foreign animal disease investigations, being tested for both classical swine fever and African swine fever. And of course, all of them have come back negative. I want to walk through a specific case study of what these morbidity mortality surveillance efforts look like, and to really paint a picture for how integrated Wildlife Services field personnel are with their state and federal partners. So this is an example that occurred in Mississippi in April of 2020. Our field biologist came across a lone boar that was in extremely poor body condition with a hoof lesion on the right front limb. As per our protocol, he did exactly what he was supposed to. He contacted his Wildlife Services state veterinarian and then staff from headquarters programs in both the National Feral Swine Program and the National Wildlife Disease Program. He also contacted his Veterinary Services area veterinarian in charge and sent photos of the animal after it was dispatched. In working this case up with the VS AVIC, it was found that this animal did have an embedded constrictive band of plastic around the hoof, which is what gives it that gross lesion. And the AVIC determined that this was not a sample that should be sent forward for a foreign animal disease workup. However, as an extra layer of precaution, this carcass was incinerated out at Mississippi State University Diagnostic Lab. And what I really love about this scenario is that it really highlights how kind of networked how wildlife services folks are networked within their personnel at both the state and federal level. This included multiple layers of leadership within both wildlife services and veterinary services. It included partnership with a state diagnostic laboratory, and just really demonstrates that our wildlife services biologists are really experts at what they do, and they are also really kind of intertwined with their partners on the ground. In fiscal year 2021, as Janet Bucknell mentioned, we did a really complete overhaul to feral swine national surveillance to align our feral swine surveillance efforts with concern around foreign animal disease introduction events. So this is predicated as truly as a foreign animal disease surveillance system. We are especially focused on classical swine fever, African swine fever, and foot and mouth disease. So in terms of the surveillance approach, we are continuing to do active surveillance for classical swine fever. So we are taking, we're using serum to look for antibodies to classical swine fever as we were kind of in version 1.0. For morbidity and mortality surveillance, we are for ASF, we are again looking for sick and inexplicably dead feral swine on the landscape. And then we're doing active observational surveillance for foot and mouth disease. We are asking our biologists after they dispatch these animals to look for evidence of any vesicular lesions in the mouth, on the gums, on the tongue, snout, and along the hooves, and to report that out. In the event that they do find an animal that has evidence of vesicular lesions, that would route up through veterinary services for an animal disease investigation framework, not unlike morbidity and mortality surveillance for African swine fever. In terms of risk factors, so these are some of the big changes that have been made to national surveillance in the past year. Our primary risk factors are those associated with introduction risks and those associated with host risks. Introduction risks include airline passenger data, and this is a really fascinating data set. So we have information from Customs and Border Protection on products that were confiscated by airline passengers. And so if, for example, there was a passenger traveling from Hanoi, Vietnam through LAX to Lincoln, Nebraska with, say, a pig head, and that was confiscated at LAX, we know that the risk of introduction would, in the absence of confiscation, would have been in Lincoln, Nebraska. And so we can use that data to drive our risk of introduction based on airline passenger cargo data. We also, for fiscal year 22, have added mail interdiction data, also out of Customs and Border Protection. We are also using the presence of landfills and seaports of entry to drive risk of introduction. In terms of host risk, we're looking at the presence of domestic livestock populations. So for African and classical swine fevers, we're looking just at the presence of hog production. And then for foot and mouth disease, we're looking at all hoof stock. And then we're also looking, of course, at feral swine densities across the landscape. Those are another big driver for host risks. What's really important and exciting for us about this new surveillance metric is that it can be really easily updated to address emerging threats. So as we have changes in APHIS priorities or new areas that become positive for diseases or areas that are able to eradicate existing ASF, CSF, or FMD, we can incorporate those all into our model. We are also continuing to integrate monitoring of production diseases. So we are continuing to do antibody-based surveillance for both pseudorabies and swine brucellosis. However, we are piggybacking that on the top of our foreign animal disease surveillance system. Those are not being used to assist in ranking prioritizations. And then another big change is that we increased our sample size over twofold. So we are now in line with the OIE associated with a 1% detection rate. And I know we're not quite done with fiscal year 21, but we are on track to hit all of our metrics. So it's been a tremendous lift for our field biologists in the past year, but we're really, really excited about this new surveillance metric. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Sarah Bevins, who will talk about ASF planning and preparedness activities in feral swine.
Great. Thanks, Vienna. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Sarah Bevins. I'm a biologist at the National Wildlife Research Center and Wildlife Services. And I'm going to be going over some of the activities we've been working on for the past few years with our colleagues in veterinary services and our other state and federal partners to plan for any potential ASF introduction into feral swine. Next slide, please. So if you've been attending this week, some of the other ASF Action seminars, you know that the range or where we find African swine fever in the world has increased pretty dramatically within the past few years. And with that increase in geographic range comes an increased risk of potential introduction into the United States. Next slide, please. And we're obviously, many of us are obviously very concerned with the potential for it to be introduced into domestic swine populations or into production facilities. But there's also the potential that ASF could be introduced into feral swine populations. And you already heard a little bit about feral swine distribution in the United States so far this morning. This map up on the slide shows a little more detail in terms of where we find feral swine in the US in blue. And like Dr. Scheer and Dr. Brown mentioned, most of those populations are found in the Southeast and along the West Coast, but you can see there's also isolated pockets in other areas of the US as well. So it's not just a potential concern for one specific region. And we also have populations in US territories. Next slide, please. So the question kind of that comes up first, obviously, is if there is an ASF detection in feral swine, what happens? What are the next steps? And this is going to be very similar to what was discussed yesterday in terms of some of the activities that would occur if ASF was detected in domestic pigs. Initially, an infected zone would be established around that sick or dead animal within the first 72 hours. And that zone would surround all ASF positive feral swine that are detected right off the bat, and then it would go out another 2 to 3 times the home range of feral swine. And this 2 to 3 times number comes out of a lot of the work that has been going on in Europe for many years now, since they have been dealing with African swine fever in wild boar populations for quite some time. Around that initial infected zone that would be set up, there would also be a buffer zone that would surround the infected zone, and then a surveillance zone surrounding all of those. And obviously, kind of the first question is, if we're trying to set up an infected zone that's 2 to 3 times the size of a feral swine home range, what is the home range size of feral swine in the United States? And luckily, colleagues in wildlife services and in academic institutions around the United States have been trying to answer this question for many years. And they've collected a lot of data by putting GPS collars on feral swine, and those collars record their movements on the landscape and give us the data and information we need to answer these types of questions. And most of you on this call have probably worked with pigs or with feral swine in some way, shape, or form, so you can likely appreciate the difficulty of getting a collar to stay on an animal that essentially has no neck. So this work is not easy, but luckily it has been going on for quite a while, and it's proved invaluable when doing some of these planning activities. Next slide, please. And so analyzing all of those data, all of those collar data from feral swine across the United States, produced an average monthly home range size of about 3.4 square kilometers. And so basically saying that feral swine are going to move around the landscape in general about 3.4 kilometers per side, if you're thinking about kind of a home range that's a square. But when we're talking about infected zone sizes and control areas, usually we're talking about a radius, right? And we're talking about how far out from an infected carcass a line would be drawn to the edge of a zone. And so if you kind of shift to thinking about a radius, the radius of a 3.4 square kilometer area is 1 kilometer approximately. And so if we're going to have an infected zone that's 2 to 3 times that, that indicates that the infected zone radius will go out 3 kilometers from an infected animal. And this is the same zone radius that is set for a domestic pig finding as well in terms of initial response. We do know that larger movements do occur. Some animals will move much more than 3.4 square kilometers in a month. And we know that home range estimates for feral swine can vary pretty dramatically depending on where you are in the country, the resources that are available to the animals, especially water. But we also know from some work that came out of Dr. Kim Pepin's lab at the National Wildlife Research Center that contact is relatively uncommon between feral swine that are more than 2 kilometers apart on the landscape. And obviously contact is what we're interested in if we are talking about feral swine and ASF transmission from one individual to another. So these zones appear to work in terms of an initial response of capturing the majority of animals that may be moving on the landscape and the movements that are actually relevant to African swine fever transmission. Next slide, please. And this is what that looks like visually. These are maps that are available in the ASF Redbook. On the left side of your screen, you can see there is one infected individual with the white X, and then around that you'd have the infected zone surrounded by a 2-kilometer buffer zone and a 5-kilometer surveillance zone. So that's kind of the idealized image. In reality, it's often very difficult to detect sick or dying wildlife on the landscape, and there likely would be more than one animal found once ASF is detected in feral swine. And in that case, that 3 kilometers would start from the farthest out carcass, possibly giving you a larger infected zone size in the initial response. Next slide, please. And so these zones, essentially they're delineating where management actions would occur on the landscape. And so what those actions are, talked about establishing these infected zones and these areas of control right off the bat. And then the next step is to determine the extent of spread. So having wildlife specialists on the ground looking for sick or dead pigs on the landscape to determine how far out it has spread, and then you adjust your area of control as needed to encompass all of those positive animals. Within the control area, a bunch of different actions may occur, and these are just actions related to feral swine, since most of the actions related to domestic swine were touched on yesterday. There may be hunting or access restrictions that are implemented in cooperation with emergency management teams and with our state partners. Carcass detection and removal is going to be a big one. A lot of research has shown that ASF transmission in wild boar is often tied to contact with infected carcasses. And we have talked about this during some other days this week, and just the hardiness of this virus and its persistence in carcasses. Feral swine population reduction would also be one of the management actions that would be implemented in order to halt transmission of this pathogen. And of course, testing of sick and dead animals as well as healthy animals would be occurring throughout as well. Next slide, please. So those are kind of the initial actions that would happen right off the bat. But we're also trying to look at what would an outbreak look like over time, because these outbreaks obviously can last some time, and that knowing kind of those dynamics helps us plan and be prepared. And you don't have to worry a whole lot about the details on this slide, but basically this is work from Dr. Kim Pepin, and each of those gray squares represents a landscape, 50 kilometers by 50 kilometers, and each gray dot is an individual feral swine that we put in computer simulations. And then on day 2, you introduce African swine fever, and you can see as the days progress, infected animals and carcasses showing up on the landscape. And that helps us get an idea of how large a culling zone might be over time, and also how many animals may be on the landscape in terms of feral swine that would need to be managed or carcasses removed. Next slide, please. And knowing all that is going into a lot of our planning and logistics so that we can determine what we would need in the event of an ASF finding in feral swine in terms of personnel that may need to be deployed, traps that would be required, fencing, all of those things, so that we can be ready to respond quickly if needed. And a lot of those specifics related to the tools we use and wildlife services and how we use them are going to be covered by Dr. Julie Lennick, who is coming up next. So I will turn it over to her.
Thanks, Dr. Bevins. Yeah, just as a quick recap, great information from Deanna Brown on what detection looks like, our current feral swine activities, and what we're doing currently operationally on the ground. And then from Sarah Bevins on our preparedness and research that's gone on to understand better the feral swine movement, home range, and what we're really looking at. So I'll go into more specifics on our response capabilities, tools available, and where we're headed if there were an African swine fever incursion in feral swine. Next slide, please, Sienna. What we're looking at here is really a high-level approach to what our response would be. And because there are so many variables with what you've seen already, different population densities, vastly different areas in the United States and our territories where feral swine exist, and the geographic and vegetation differences, I'm going to focus on the details here on our available tools, instead of going into what an exact response would look like, because it is variable and we're preparing for so many different scenarios at the same time. A lot of our work over the last decade has been to identify gaps in our knowledge and to make sure that we're covered in supplies that would be needed. Dr. Bevins just gave that quick snapshot of the tools, whether it's snares or ground traps or baiting, and making sure that we are adequately really banked up with those supplies. And then I'm going to stress the integrative approach that we're taking at Wildlife Services, from our headquarters level down to our research and operational teams, and making sure that we are sharing information as it's available or as that information changes, and that we have a unified message going out to our internal and external stakeholders. As an example, this whole week of informational the teaching and the sharing of information that's been going on. So going into a little bit more detail. Next slide, please. What we're looking to do in our current control efforts involve a combined effort to get further information and be as prepared as we can to detect the virus if and when it becomes a disease incursion in the United States. That is complicated in all feral and wild animals for the reasons that were covered, especially by Dr. Brown. The population densities, the determination of where these animals are, and if there is any further spread, simply finding morbidity and mortality events, finding these carcasses. They are subject to predation, degradation on the landscape, scavengers. So being aware and teaching and relying on our wildlife disease biologists and feral swine biologists on the ground to recognize those one-offs or those suspicious events, working with our area veterinarians in charge and working these up appropriately as foreign animal disease investigations so that we are able and prepared to detect the virus. Determining the extent of spread, as Dr. Sarah Bevins went into, understanding the contact between feral swine, the movement of these animals, and then what we're focusing on right now is carcass removal, testing as appropriate. Again, the ongoing work with swine brucellosis, pseudorabies virus, and then our foreign animal disease enhanced activities that have really ramped up very recently, and the ongoing work for feral swine population reduction. Again, we believe we're looking at somewhere around 6 million pigs in the United States, feral swine in the United States. Next slide, please. So I'll go over these, and I've got a photo on the next slide, but the tools that are available for us are combined into different groups. Some is surveillance, understanding where the feral swine are, and if we do have any morbidity or mortality events. So whether that's cameras or drones or helicopters used for surveillance, different tools used for catching, baiting, removing pigs, between traps, snares, using Judas pigs or decoy pigs, fencing to contain or to decrease the possibility of contact between feral swine population and domestic swine populations, and then removal activities, whether that's sharpshooters, future research or potential approval of toxicants in the future. We don't have toxicants right now, but that's a possibility, and we're keeping that on, as a potential within the toolbox. And just using a combination of these, depending on the situation, if we were to have an incursion, which ones would be used and what's best situated for each individual situation. Next slide, please. There's some great pictures from our folks on the ground. Upper left is showing some infrared imagery, a great deal of night activity, night vision, and kind of meeting the animals where they are when they might be more active and being responsive to that. The upper right is showing our experience with removal and using baiting to get some of these pigs to go where we want them to go. The center picture is showing some fencing and some trapping activities, feral swine aerial surveillance going on, and then understanding that in certain situations it may be appropriate to use hog dogs or dogs to usher these pigs in, depending on the prevalence and the population of feral swine in a specific area. Next slide, please. There's really two different, very large scenarios that could happen if we were to have African swine fever detected within the United States. And the first scenario is the initial detection being in domestic swine, whether that's a backyard producer, a slaughter establishment, or a commercial facility. Wildlife Services would mobilize operations to prevent African swine fever from spilling over from the domestic side into feral swine. This is really a protection and a walling off of the domestic swine side to avoid any spillover into feral swine populations. And Wildlife Services could also mobilize as part of an agency response to assist veterinary services and the rest of our APHIS team in the depopulation of domestic side. So version 1 is initial detection would be on the domestic side, and we would do everything we can to minimize any spillover and contain that to the initial affected premise or the premises where it's first detected. Next slide, please. Scenario 2 is the opposite, where the initial detection for African swine fever is in feral swine, as we've discussed with our ongoing work with a morbidity and mortality event, that we find some abnormal mortality that it's reported from a stakeholder or one of our biologists in the field. And this requires really a comprehensive multi-agency approach to try to contain, control, eradicate, and lower those feral swine populations to decrease risk of further disease spread within the feral swine population, and then protecting our domestic swine population from any incursion or from wildlife to livestock transmission. So two very different scenarios to prepare for, and I believe they're both feasible, reasonable things, and the reason that we're working on this kind of both sides of the coin, depending on the specific scenario. Next slide, please. Our ongoing work for preparedness is really multifactorial. We understand and have estimated the supplies that would be needed for an outbreak. ammunition for removal, for dispatch of feral swine, and banking of the appropriate ammunition for the response efforts. Working with our subject matter experts in veterinary services and our environmental engineers on carcass disposal options. If there were a large scale outbreak, we would certainly use multiple different options or consider multiple different options for carcass disposal, whether that's composting on site, burial options, or incineration of those carcasses to avoid any future virus spread or any environmental disruptions that would go on there. Depending on the feral swine density in an area of detection, again, different tools may be needed. So our preparedness efforts are focused on those, whether that's trail cameras, drones, other surveillance tools, or using dogs in areas of low density versus just baiting, trapping, and dispatching animals in areas of higher density. Of course, any of those activities are personnel dependent, and keeping our own teams informed of the plans, trained up, and certainly ready to respond with our emergency response capabilities. All of this is a very integrated and coordinated preparedness. We were across wildlife services, but truly across APHIS with our national preparedness, our NPIC team, veterinary services, and our colleagues within wildlife services, from headquarters to operations, our research teams, which Dr. Sarah Bevins and Dr. Kim Pepin have contributed greatly as far as the information that was shared in the previous part of this talk. And then again, our emergency response, being able to have our biologists on the ground and be able to respond very quickly in the event of an incursion. Next slide, please. This is there's quite a bit of alphabet soup, and I apologize to all those who are not within the agency or who are out of the country and not familiar with all of our different teams. What this is really intended to represent is how coordinated and how much communication goes on. So within wildlife services, we have frequent meetings between the National Feral Swine Program, the National Wildlife Disease Program, and the National Wildlife Research Center. The three of us speaking to you today represent each of those agencies or each of those teams. We also have meetings with our swine staff and our National Preparedness and Incident Management Coordination Group within veterinary services, making sure that we're all on the same page and optimized for data collection, management, again, that carcass management and carcass disposal component, and being as prepared as possible for any scenarios that would come up, understanding our regulatory authority, huge amount of coordination for our diagnostics and our laboratory personnel. As Dr. Brown said, these samples do go to our Plum Island for an animal disease diagnostic lab, and we greatly appreciate the teams within the National Veterinary Labs and the support of our diagnostic experts. And then communication and interfacing with the wildlife services state directors and our state animal health officials so that everyone knows what to do, who to talk to, how decisions are made for submission of samples, where results go to, who's doing what, and that we're all in as coordinated as possible for our preparedness events. Next slide, please. Again, within wildlife services, I just went over those programs and centers. Veterinary services, huge amount of work that has been done, and the previous days of this African Swine Fever Action Week were given to you by the National Preparedness and Incident Coordination Team, our swine health staff, and the subject matter experts in the swine team, and the Center for Epidemiology and Animal Health within veterinary services. We could not do any of this without the information and sharing of information from our industry partners, and that ongoing communication that needs to happen between all of the stakeholder and industry groups. Dr. Scheer mentioned our coordination with Canada and the North American partners, and I believe everyone is aware of the recent work that's been going on in the Caribbean with Dominican Republic as a detection, and then our ongoing and enhanced work going on in the Caribbean. So a lot of collaboration, a lot of communication that's necessary and very valuable to us as we continue to work on our preparedness activities and be prepared for a possibility of a response. Next slide, please. Happy to take questions. Again, Dr. Vienna Brown at the beginning, Sarah Bevins in the middle, and then myself, Julie Lennox. And Hallie, I know we have a lot of activity. I've sort of seen the chat bouncing around. So we'll all be here to answer questions for you. We just appreciate the opportunity to wrap this week up. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that excellent information. And as you said, we do have a lot of questions in the Q&A. I did notice some questions in the chat, and I would ask if you have the chance, somebody did paste in some of the questions already from the chat, but they're much easier to scroll through in the Q&A. The chat gets overly cumbersome. So my goal is to try to get to as many questions as we can in the time we have remaining. I do see that some folks have their hands raised. Given that we've only got about 25 minutes left for questions, I'm going to focus on the Q&A. Like I said, if we have time at the end, I'll see if we can go live, but I don't want to slow us down with that. So I do want to mention that as we jump in. I did see one question in the chat, though, that I do want to ask Dr. Lennox. That's just to define what is a Judas pig.
Thanks. It's probably a biblical reference for an animal that will lead you in. They're kind of a leader pig that we might use to bait or to bring other animals into an area, referencing Judas in the Bible, who maybe led a group in a different way. Thank you. That's a great question.
Appreciate that clarification. Okay, next question. And Dr. Scheer, I think this one is probably for you. The New Haven Register reported today that Denmark built a fence along their border in 2019 to protect the Danish pork industry by preventing wild swine crossing from Germany and breeding with farm pigs or possibly bringing in the disease. Might the USA erect physical barriers if ASF were found in feral pigs in a region of the United States?
I've seen the fence in Denmark. I visited Denmark to see that facility and just to see how they were dealing with wild boar. And they did erect a fence. The fence has openings for small animals to get through. It also has openings at roads and rivers, and because they according to the environmental law, they can't fence off or fence the rivers and the streams. If we had, and I think Dr. Lennox covered this, but if we had a problem with feral swine and based on the research in epidemiology, we'd locate where the pods were or the groups that hung together and where the infection was. And as I think happened in the Czech Republic, there would be an effort to isolate them, either that by fencing or some other method, until we could go in and eradicate them as a problem. Now, each of those would be handled different based on topography and other things that they had to do with where the pigs were. And our wildlife services people are pretty well prepared to with scenarios to go in and deal with those situations. But as I said, each one would be a little different depending on where the pigs were, how many pigs we were dealing with, what was within the area where the pigs were identified as being infected. Is it rural? Is it urban areas? We have all those things to deal with. So each scenario will be a little different. So permanent barriers is not something that would be of a choice for us in this case. Thanks.
Thanks, Dr. Scheer. And I should note that there are a lot of questions, there are some questions in the chat that are focused on feral swine. I've been holding feral swine questions throughout the week to get to feral swine Friday. So my goal in the Q&A is really to focus on those feral swine specific questions. And if we still have time, we'll come back to the other ones that we may have already touched on earlier in the week. So thanks for understanding there. Next question, Dr. Scheer, I think this one's going to be for you again. Under OIE rules, why does ASF in feral swine trigger border closures, but that is not the case for classical swine fever? Can the rules be changed? So
certainly the rules can be changed. OIE meets they have science committees that meet quarterly. They also have committees that, the meeting of all the nations come about once a year. They all get together to discuss the regulations and the chapters, and they are reviewed. I'm not sure why ASF causes border closures versus CSF, except perhaps that there is a vaccine for CSF, so it can be controlled under those circumstances, whereas ASF, we currently have no vaccine, and the only method to control it is eradication, which would trigger a situation where countries would not want that pork or those pork products coming into their country. So that's why the trade impacts are there for ASF. Now, the United States restricts meat products from CSF countries also. So there are, in a sense, whether OIE or not, each country can decide what regulations or how they want to influence or restrict products based on disease presence or absence. So the United States does restrict CSF, which is a good example of what went on in the Dominican Republic before they even got ASF. We had restricted their pork and pork products from the to be imported into the United States based on the fact that they already had CSF. Thanks, Hallie.
Appreciate that. I believe this next question is for Dr. Linick. Can javelina contract ASF? Symptomatic or asymptomatic? Symptomatic. Could they spread ASF?
I will double check this, but I do not believe javelina are susceptible or possible for transmission. Sarah, do you have any?
Yeah, it's a great question, but and there's not a whole lot of work on it, but there was a study, I don't know, must be more than 50 years ago now, that showed that they were completely resistant to infection, and so that's kind of the common thought right now. And they are javelina are New World pigs, meaning they're not true suids, so that might explain their resistance in that study.
Dr. Brown, anything to add there?
Nope. Julie and Sarah nailed it. Thank you.
Great. Appreciate that. Next question. Is a Razorback a feral or domestic production pig? Not sure, Dr. Linick, Dr. Brown, which of you wants to take that?
We really need Dr. Tim Smizer on this call. He's our feral swine geneticist. I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. I'm sure he's listening and he's outraged that I don't, but I really don't know the question to that. So my apologies. Julie or Sarah?
Agree. I think we'll have to dig into that one a little bit on the Razorbacks. Thanks.
We'll come back to it if we happen to get an update. Oh, Dr. Bevins.
I was just going to say, usually it's more related to college football than anything else, than either.
Indeed, that was the first thing that came to my mind as well. Thanks for that. Okay, next question. Saskatchewan has a growing population of feral swine in Canada. Is there work being done to patrol the border and prevent movement from one country to the other? Dr. Scheer, do you maybe want to start, and then our wildlife services folks can follow up on that?
I think the feral pig population and their ability to move is one of the reasons we worked with Canada on the regulations that we have. It's very hard to control a wild species and their movement. And as the population grows, it becomes even more difficult because they have to seek new territory. But I'm going to stop there because I'm going beyond my knowledge, and I'll let the wildlife services folks talk about. I don't think we're doing anything to restrict their movement, but again, we do have reduction policies in place in many states to reduce those populations. So as they cross, they would be, we hope, intercepted and dealt with. That's all. Thanks.
Thanks, Dr. Scheer. And Hallie, I can add on that we have worked with our colleagues in Saskatchewan, University of Saskatchewan, Dr. Ryan Brooks and the team there. We've been sharing information. They've collaborated with our veterinary services partners at the Center for Epidemiology and Animal Health on understanding any disease differences or topography, vegetation, movement differences with the Canadian population. So certainly we have shared information and have collaborated with the veterinary experts and the wildlife disease teams within Saskatchewan.
Yep, and just one follow-up point to Dr. Lennox's comment. We also, Montana is currently a feral swine free state, but they are receiving some funding from the National Feral Swine Damage Management Program to do some ongoing surveillance efforts, especially since they have such, unique geography and some really unique species. And so really wanting to make sure that we are on top of feral swine if and when they arrive in Montana as quickly as possible. So you're definitely mindful of that. And the state of Montana is really concerned about feral swine coming in from Canada. So we've been providing as much support as we can from the headquarters level.
Thanks. Next question, Dr. Scheer, I know this one's for you. Could U.S. federal efforts to test wildlife for ASF virus piggyback, apologies for the pun, on the current SARS-CoV-2 wildlife testing, and that's part of the American Rescue Plan provision? Could testing personnel, funds, and other resources be shared?
Well, definitely we're looking for the best and most economic way to do that testing. So we are looking at different species also as part of the American Rescue Plan, and whether those species can, one, and be infected with the virus, and two, spread the virus amongst themselves or possibly to other wildlife species. So those projects are under discussion, and there's ongoing work going to decide the direction that we take the American Rescue Plan in regard to that testing. So stay tuned. I think it's going to be a real interesting next couple of years as we put those funds to good work.
Thanks, Dr. Scheer. And for those that aren't familiar with the American Rescue Plan, APHIS did receive funding to learn more and conduct monitoring and surveillance for SARS-CoV-2 in animals. So it's specific to SARS-CoV-2 and not ASF there. So I wanted to clarify that. Next question, Dr. Brown, it looks like this one's for you. For swine brucellosis and pseudorabies on the Texas county maps, it would be interesting to know if the counties containing disease prevalence versus those with no prevalence are due to testing in those counties versus not testing in other counties, or if the counties with pathogen prevalence are near agriculture areas. If I need to repeat that, let me know.
Thanks, Hallie, and that's a really great question. So certainly there is some element of sampling bias there. So Wildlife Services is non-regulatory. We just are operating on cooperator property that we have permission to be working on and sampling swine across both space and time in those areas. But there is certainly an element of sampling bias there. The map I demonstrated was just from aggregate of fiscal year 2020, and so I think it might be helpful to kind of aggregate maybe over a longer span to see if we capture some different counties and some different seroprevalences in that as well. But it's hard to say. I mean, we certainly have the data to do it, but off the top of my head, I don't know. Some of those areas that we don't have samples from would be areas that don't have feral swine or much in the way of feral swine. So counties that are heavily urbanized. Or other reasons that there would be low feral swine populations. Some of the other areas might be that we don't have cooperating landowners in those areas. Some of it could be a logistical personnel issue where we just don't have wildlife services people working in those areas. So certainly a number of different factors on why we do not have uniform distribution of samples and feral swine dispatching across each of the counties. But I think if we aggregated it over a longer time point, we would see more of those counties represented. Thanks, Hallie.
Thank you. Next question. Is the metric used for feral swine national surveillance also used in domestic swine as well? Is there active surveillance occurring at farms and in slaughter establishments? So I think that's a two-part question, one being related to what's our feral swine surveillance, and then I guess what's also happening with domestic swine. So maybe we'll have our wildlife services folks take the first part and Dr. Scheer can weigh in on the domestic surveillance.
Sorry, wrong button. So Hallie, can you repeat the part that's Wildlife Servicey?
Yes, indeed. Is the metric used for feral swine national surveillance used in domestic swine as well?
You know, I'm not even sure the answer on that. So the 3 diseases that we're doing our antigen-based diagnostics for were worked up in partnership with veterinary services. I know VS has a domestic surveillance stream as well. I could certainly kind of spitball what I've heard as we go along, but this is not an appropriate forum for that. So I don't know if Julie or Sarah know more on that, or this certainly feels like Dr. Scheer might be best equipped.
Yeah, Hallie, I was just going to ask maybe that the submitter of that to give us a little more information on which metric specifically they're asking about. So yeah, we do have a little bit different, of course, different mission space on what we're looking for and our prevalence and disease estimates in feral swine. That does differ significantly from what occurs on the domestic side. But if the submitter of that can just maybe give us a little bit more detail so we can answer a little more accurately. Thanks.
So on the domestic side of pseudorabies and brucellosis, we feel that we've eradicated those diseases in domestic populations. We do have ASF and CSF surveillance going on in the United States, and that's based on sick pig submissions, garbage feeders with sick pigs, found feral and sick and dying swine or found deads. So all that's ongoing, and we collect those samples and test them. So any pig submitted to a diagnostic lab in the United States, if it's an own lab and they want, and the pig is ill, we coordinate and test for CSF and ASF on those samples. So I don't know what the metrics are for that, but based on pseudorabies and brucellosis, it's based on pig numbers in the state, and we do statistical sampling every year of the number of pigs that are sent to slaughter. And those pigs are tested for pseudorabies and brucellosis. So, thanks.
Thanks, Dr. Scheer. Next question, Dr. Scheer, this may be for you as well. I'm not sure if we have an answer, but are any of these swine diseases linked to climate change?
Good question. Certainly, one of the things that we've seen is if we had a soft tick problem and we had a disease in soft ticks or ticks in general, and we've seen a migration northward of ticks as a result of climate change. So certainly we may see changes in disease distribution based on that. There's still work to be done on that, and it'll take time. I know some states have reported increases in things like blue tongue and things like that, and they think that's due to a warmer climate and some of the vectors moving north. So I'll just stop there and see if the wildlife services people have anything to add.
I concur with Dr. Scheer on the possibility of expanded range or changed range of the ticks. Additionally, Dr. Ryan Miller and the team at the Center for Epidemiology and Animal Health have done a substantial amount of work on mast or material that the pigs can eat, feral swine will eat. And as we look at severe weather changes or warming or cooling patterns that might change vegetation or availability for habitat, I could certainly see a theoretical shift in feral swine density based on some of that vegetation and food availability. So I think it's quite possible.
Thanks, Dr. Olenek. This next question may be for you as well. Do feral swine populations migrate seasonally or otherwise throughout the year?
I'll actually see if Sarah wants to take that. I know she's done a lot more work on the movement. Sarah, do you want to take a first stab and I'll add on if we need to?
Yeah, it's a good question. In general, they're not considered migratory. There is some evidence in northern climates that they move much greater distances than they do in more temperate climates or where there's a lot more water. But in general, they're not considered to be a migratory animal.
Dr. Bevins, I think this next question then may be for you. What studies have been done in U.S. feral swine home range versus European wild boar?
Oh, definitely a good question. There's separate studies in Europe on wild boar, and then there's like our own body of literature in the United States. And interestingly enough, a lot of times the answers are fairly similar. So you'll see similar averages, but there's some distinct differences as well. Obviously, our landscapes can be very different in the United States versus Europe. So while the averages are similar, there's definitely some differences that have to be kept in mind, but there are published studies on both that are available.
Thanks. Next question. When you say that feral swine do not usually have contact with other feral swine, do you mean contact with other live feral swine or both live feral swine and dead feral swine carcasses? Not sure who wants to take that one.
I think that was related to something I presented, and most of that data does come from contact between live individuals. So collared animals that then have contact with other individuals. But the carcass question is a good one, and one that a lot of people want to explore more thoroughly in terms of what contact rates to carcasses are.
Okay, next question. What is an appropriate role for international partners to play in supporting your efforts? Dr. Scheer, do you want to take that?
I couldn't catch all that question. Holly, it broke up on my end. Can you repeat that, please?
Sure. What is an appropriate role for international partners to play in supporting your efforts?
A good example, I think, is what's going on right now in the Dominican Republic. They're battling African swine fever right now for the first time in 40 years. And the Americas in general, all the American nations and the Caribbean nations have come together to discuss preparedness, to discuss testing, to discuss how we can best help the Dominican Republic. So that's one role. Also, there are groups like USAID, WHO, OIE, FAO, ORISA, and AICA. These are all international groups that help in different aspects of aid to countries that have ASF. So there are a lot of avenues of support out there that countries can tap into, especially countries that don't have the resources and need that assistance. So there's several avenues. The other piece of it is the OIE develops terrestrial code for how disease transmissions will be handled in the world, and that recognition. Now, ASF is currently not one of the diseases that they give status for, but certainly the countries communicate any infection, and that's posted by the OIE member countries, so that everybody else knows what's going on in the world with different countries in regards to disease. So there's all kinds of different directions and support.
Thanks, Dr. Scheer.
You bet.
We've got time for one or maybe two more quick questions. So I think this is for our wildlife services team. Are dogs being trained to detect feral swine alive or dead?
Yeah, I'll take that one, Holly. That's a great question. And yes, so we have our wildlife services detector dogs who are housed in Maryland, and they are trained on two elements of feral swine. One is using them to detect scat. So we typically use those dogs when we think we have eradicated feral swine in a specific region. We will deploy those dogs to see if they're able to detect any feral swine scat. But that they could also certainly be utilized in an outbreak scenario. To detect, help us find additional feral swine on the landscape, or to help us confirm that we have eradicated feral swine from an outbreak area. We also have those same dogs that are trained for carcass detection. And so again, the idea being that these dogs would be able to help us find and remove carcasses of feral swine that died from African swine fever on the landscape. Again, kind of circling back to Dr. Bevan's presentation, that carcass-based transmission for African swine fever is a really important component of viral epidemiology. So wanting to make sure that we get as many of those sick and dead pigs off the landscape. So we have dogs trained for both of those scenarios, and would almost certainly rely on them in an outbreak scenario.
Thanks. Okay, one last question. With regard to carcasses and predators, can coyotes, birds, other pigs, possums, etc., can they spread disease? Could they spread African swine fever?
Vina, do you want to take this?
Okay, I'll start, but jump in wherever. So African swine fever virus is a pretty hardy virus. We know that. We know that fomite transmission is a pretty ready route of viral dissemination from place to place, barn to barn. So certainly that is not out of the realm of possibility that there would be scavenging or predating, and that could kind of contribute to the virus on the landscape. We have been doing some work looking at the use of hydrated lime as a deterrent for scavenging to kind of buy us some time, if you will, from when the carcass is detected to when it can be removed from the landscape. In case there's a lag there, thinking about the possibility of using hydrated lime to deter scavenging, to give us a little bit of extra time to get that carcass removed. Sarah, you want to have anything else to add?
I think you got most of it. There are a couple of studies that have looked at scavenging and scavengers on carcasses, poultures, and mesocarnivores. Overall, the risk to them contributing to spread is considered very low, and in some cases maybe even eliminated by the fact that they are consuming the carcass, so they're kind of helping remove it from the landscape in that infectious pool. But there is some initial work out there, if you're interested in tracking it down, that suggests that overall scavenging hopefully is not going to contribute to large scale jumps of the virus on the landscape.
Great. Thank you so much. And I apologize because we have more questions than we have time, but thanks for all those great questions that we were able to get through. And appreciate you all staying with us through African Swine Fever Action Week. We've had great participation and engagement. Can't thank you enough for that. And I want to give Dr. Scheer the opportunity to just say a few final closing comments.
I'd just like to close out by saying we're really proud of all of our speakers, proud of the work that the Wildlife Services folks are doing for us, and really appreciate the attention. This was put together for the producers, and we want them to know and be aware of this disease, what to do to prevent the disease, and other aspects that they need to consider in regards to the disease, and feral swine would certainly be one of them. Appreciate the time and attention. Hopefully the information is useful, and it will help us prevent and keep the disease out of the United States. Appreciate everyone's attention and cooperation, and we feel this has been very successful. We've averaged about 1,100 to 1,200 people on every call, so that's very good, and that's the way we get information out. Thank you very much for your participation, and have a good weekend.
Thank you, everyone. This concludes our webinar, and as Dr. Scheer said, have a great weekend.
Recording stopped.